Grace to you and peace from God our Creator and Christ our Redeemer. Please be seated. Some number of years ago, I was asked to lead a retreat for the lay leaders of a small congregation nestled in a little town in Connecticut. But this was not an ordinary retreat, as the diocese wanted me to help lead them in discernment about whether to stay open or to close. What's more, I was informed the diocese felt that the best option would be for the church to shut down. Now, this admittedly sounds a bit harsh, and the reality was that it was a deeply toxic congregation, rife with conflict and bullying behavior, such that church meetings frequently devolved into shouting matches and threats. The bishop's staff had tried to work with them for years to resolve the conflicts and become a healthy community, but to no avail. Now the bishop felt that the best opportunity for new life would be if the congregation shut down and its members started fresh in different congregations. But here's the thing. To understand the root of the conflict, you'd have to go back a ways into history. At one point, the town where the church was located had been a relatively affluent one, and the membership of the congregation matched that demographic. But around the time of the Great Depression, there was a wave of immigration into the community, a wave of immigration made up of foreigners who were poorer and of a lower class than other church members. And when those new immigrants started showing up at church on Sunday morning, the regulars were not so sure about sharing their things with them. So they put away the church's good china and refused to let the new people use it. So to recap, the church's conflict went all the way back to the Great Depression and a fight over the china set. The 8 o'clockers are asking if that was a metaphor. No, it was actually a fight over the china set. Now, the modern conflict was no longer about teacups. In fact, most people probably didn't know the story. The conflict and bad behavior had simply been there for so long that that's all they had ever known in the community. But its genesis was a mentality of scarcity and a cycle of retribution that perpetuated itself for nearly a century. I suppose you could say that I failed my task in a way, because at the conclusion of the retreat, the parish council did not decide to close, but instead opted to try and make a go of it and set out some next steps to begin to change the culture in their community. I don't know how they are doing, though I do think about them from time to time, and I pray that they have made progress together. What should the owner of the vineyard do? Jesus asks the religious leaders who have gathered around him. The wicked tenants, having previously killed the man's servants when they came around to collect his portion of the harvest, have now escalated the violence and killed the owner's son in a greedy attempt to claim his inheritance as their own. This is the second parable in a row that Jesus spoke to these religious leaders. The parable of the two sons we heard last week followed up immediately by the one we hear this morning. And hearing Jesus' words, they respond that the vineyard owner should put those miserable tenants to their death. It's important to note that Jesus doesn't actually prescribe this brutal response. It comes directly from those who are listening to his words. And even though they are starting to realize that Jesus is talking about them, their response is one of violent judgment and punishment. It is as if they cannot help themselves, as if they cannot break free of the cycle of escalating retribution and violence. In the first story of creation, the very first chapter of Genesis, we find the profound theological claim that we are made in the image of God, each of us and all of us. But For as long as humans have existed, we get confused and we begin to think that God must bear human likeness. We begin to think that God must be rather like us. I think that so much of God's judgment that we find in Scripture, so much of the way that we ascribe violence and retribution to God comes from this mistake, this confusion. We bear the likeness of God, not the other way around. But we are not gods, and God is not like us. What should the vineyard owner do? We hear the parable and we hear a story of escalating violence and rejection, and our limited imaginations can only imagine more of the same. But at its core, underneath the cycles of violence, this is a story of an act of greed born of a mentality of scarcity. In this great and beautiful vineyard that the vineyard owner has so carefully prepared for them, the tenants only see what they do not have. They only feel a fear of not having enough, and they chafe at the thought of returning to the vineyard owner what is his due. So they kill the servant sent to collect the tithe, and at last, when they see the vineyard owner's son coming, they concoct a plan to kill him as well. For if the son is dead, they reason, then they will owe payment to no one. If they kill the son, then they will at last have it all to themselves. Because all they can imagine is not having enough. All they can imagine is perpetually needing more. But it's not just the tenants in the parable, is it? Do we not all struggle with this mentality of scarcity in our lives? Are we not fed a constant diet of warnings about not having enough? Discover this surprising tip to secure financial independence. Invest in these 3 companies to diversify your portfolio today. When is it too early to start saving for retirement? Learn about these 5 ways to get into the housing market and profit from real estate today. In an effort to learn more about our new home here in Canada, Matt and I subscribe to the Globe and Mail, which generally I enjoy, but I tell you the constant bombardment of real estate coverage and financial advice columns always leaves me feeling anxious, like I'm not doing enough to secure my future. Forever and always, the message is that we do not have enough, that we need more, that the goal of security and happiness is just around the corner, just a little bit further to go, that if we gather and amass just a bit more, then we will finally be satisfied. But this mindset of scarcity is a direct rejection of God's abundance. God has poured unto us the abundance of the vineyard, lovingly shaped to provide us all that we could ever need. And God has poured unto us the abundance of the Son to lead us back into right relationship. Yet, in the face of our violent rejection, in the face of our scarcity and greed, God does not choose violence, but abundance. Now, to be clear, God's abundance is not without justice, but rather than the retributive justice we expect, it is a restorative justice. The good vineyard is given continually to those who will bear the fruit fit for the kingdom, to those who will respond to God's abundance by pouring it out upon the world so that all might share in it. My friends, rather than getting caught in this perpetual cycle of scarcity and retribution, a cycle that will continue without end until it completely consumes us, we must learn to live into God's abundance and to bear those good fruits fit for the kingdom. And we can do this by beginning to hold loosely and lightly to our possessions and blessings in our lives, both individually and collectively, and by responding with joy to the opportunities to give and to share more than we have received. Only then Only then do we discover the true nature of God's abundance, something that cannot be hoarded and stored away, nor something that can ever be depleted, but that abounds all the more as it is shared with joy and thanksgiving.